Welcome back, everybody, to By Faith Bible Studies. Today, I'm just coming on here to do just a quick little Bible review. I said I would do this back in the Q&A that I did with Kyle. I think it was about a year ago. So I said I would do this. Now I'm going to, because this past Christmas, just a few days ago, I got a brand new Legacy Standard Bible. So I am just really enjoying having this new Bible. Brand new translation. I think they finished it about like a year ago, like 2021. So it's been out, but I just got my first full Legacy Standard Bible. I had the New Testament, Psalms, and Proverbs little booklet before. But now I have the full one, and I love it. It's awesome. So I just wanted to come on here and just say I think it's the best translation out there. Most accurate, and just the most well done. It is, as some people would say, a bit more of a wooden translation. You might not get as much out of it if you're just reading it compared to some other translations. My personal favorite before the LSB was the ESV. I grew up on the ESV. It's quite a good literal translation, word for word, but they do make it so that it's very readable. And I have most of my verses memorized in the ESV, so it's kind of hard, like when I'm reading like famous passages that I love so much and that I have memorized in the ESV. I kind of like I'm just like, whoa, this is kind of different, you know. But I love the ESV. I don't think it's a bad translation at all. It's excellent. And the LSB, I'd say, is the most literal, most accurate word-for-word translation. But like I said, they made it very readable for the most part. It does have a little bit of woodenness where you got to kind of dig in to be able to enjoy it. I think it's the best Bible to study with. If you want to study, really get into the LSB. Previously, the NASB was the closest word-for-word translation. Then it was like the ESV. Then you kind of go further back. I think King James, New King James is kind of in the middle there. And then you got NIV and NLT and then a bunch of other ones. But those are the mainstream ones I think most people know. But yes, really recommend the LSB. I'll just show you just two examples that I've found that I think the LSB just nails. Like they nail it really well. Like things, just super small details that when I'm reading the ESV or if I'm reading the NASB, sometimes you'll be like, well, a more proper translation would be this. The LSB is that more proper translation in actual form. You no longer as much have to say, well, a better, more accurate translation would be this when you're preaching. You can just say, here it is. It's in the LSB. Obviously, it's not a perfect translation. There is no perfect translation, but it's the closest you can get to having purely word for word what the original means in the Greek and in the Hebrew. And in the Aramaic, I'd say it's the closest to that, closest thing to in English to reading Greek and Hebrew, reading it straight out of the original languages, because they did such a nice job with this. So one example, I preached through Romans, so I know Romans quite well, and one thing that I noticed was one of the most famous verses in the Bible, Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good, for those who are called according to his purpose. Very similar to what the ESV says. It has, for we know that those who love God, and then all things work together for good, who are called according to his purpose. The LSB is kind of an updated version of the NASB. So what you have with the NASB is it says, God works all things together for good for those who love him, for those who are called according to his purpose. It's a little backwards, and that's not how it is in the original. In the original Greek, it's not laid out like that. So just that slight little thing, the LSB nails. And the ESV actually does get that correct. But then there's another thing that the NASB gets correct, but the ESV does not. But the LSB, being kind of in the middle here, just nailing over and over correct things that I love. In one of my favorite passages, the passage that the Lord used to open my heart to my hardness of heart, open my eyes to see my sin. Luke 18, the parable of the Pharisee and the tax collector. It says in verse 14, this is the LSB, or verse 13 of Luke 18, but the tax collector, standing some distance away, was even unwilling to lift up his eyes to heaven, but was beating his chest, saying, God, be merciful to me, not a sinner, the sinner. And that's the correct translation, the sinner. The tax collector saw himself in light of God's holiness as the ultimate sinner. Paul sees himself as the chief of sinners. So they just nail that there. He's not just another sinner, a sinner. That's what everyone really believes. I mean, we're all sinners. We're all sinners. This is, in light of God's holiness, I am the sinner of all sinners when you compare yourself purely to God and not to anyone else. The ESV, however, says, and I love the ESV, but there are some things that it does not get completely correct. It says a sinner. The NSB does say the sinner, but I love how the LSB is just perfectly just nailing these things. I love it. You probably, if you have heard of the LSB, know about two other main features of it. So the somewhat controversial, you might even say, is in the Old Testament the use of Yahweh instead of capital Lord, Lord. There's two types of Lord, and this has been going on since the King James in English, translating the covenant name of God, which he gives to Moses, I am who I am, Yahweh. That's the correct usage of it. We don't actually know how specifically it was spoken, what it specifically sounds like, but it's most likely Yahweh. That's how it is in English. But it's the Tetragrammaton, which is I think YHWH. That's like the four letters in Hebrew. But it's translated Yahweh. So that's kind of a thing that is a little sticky. Some people say, that's not good. You don't want to use that because Jews will not say Yahweh. They will not say it. And my teacher actually in college said that if you take this LSB translation to Israel, don't show it to any Israelite or any Jew, because they will be offended and could beat you up because they take the name of God so seriously. But in this translation, is it taking the name of God unseriously? No. I think it's taking it very seriously, very holy. And God even says in Exodus 3, this is my name forever. For you guys to use. It's for my people. That's how you identify me. So there's Yahweh, and then there's Adonai, which is also Lord, but that's capital L, but then O-R-D is lowercase. So it's often easy to get it mistaken if you're reading any other English translation from the King James all the way down. It's all caps, L-O-R-D, and then just Lord, with not all caps for Adonai. So I like how it says Yahweh. It's God's name that he has given to us. So I do appreciate that the LSB has put that in there. I love that. And then another thing in the New Testament, the word doulos, Greek word doulos, is often, I think in every translation, English translation has been translated as servant or bond servant since the King James. But here in the LSB, a more accurate rendering of that is slave. It does not always 100% in the LSB say slave. Sometimes it will say bondservant in context, but or even servant if it's actually meant as servant. But most of the time, when Paul says we're slaves to Christ, we're slaves to God, we're no longer slaves to sin, And when he addresses himself, Paul, a slave of Christ. James says that when he opens up his letter. James, a slave of Jesus Christ. That's a more accurate translation of it. So I really appreciate that. The LSB just nails it. And it is readable. It's very readable. I'd say the ESV, though, is still more readable, but the LSB is even more accurate. So for studying, I highly recommend you get the LSB for studying, especially if you don't know Greek or Hebrew, because this is the closest thing you'll get to that. So yeah, I recommend the LSB. I also recommend the ESV. I appreciate the King James and the New King James, but just remember that that's the King James and New King James was not given to us directly by God. It's not directly inspired by God. It's a translation of God's inspired words, but it's not really the best translation. We have so many more manuscripts that the ESV and the LSB and the NASB, they all draw from. So there are added things that are not meant to be in the King James. And God says in his word, don't add to my word, and don't take away from it. You don't play around with it. So with the manuscript evidence, we want to get as close to the original as possible, what God actually wrote to us. So I think for the King James in his time, it was wonderful. Amazing what they were able to do. But now we have so much more. So I don't want to get King James onlyists mad, but I do really hope that King James onlyists can open up their perspective and accept that the LSB. I go to the Master's University. My professors, who I trust so much with spiritual things and theological issues, and their takes on theological things, because they're men of God and they're great theologians and they're the best scholars in the world. I know them personally because they're my teachers, many of them. Abner Chow, who's the head of the committee who translated the LSB. I know that they're not going to lead you astray. There may be, compared to the King James, missing verses, but those verses were actually added later on, according to the manuscript evidence. So I just really think, I know the people who translated the LSB. They're wonderful men of God. And I'm serious. They are some of the smartest biblical scholars in the world. Like, if you want to see actual biblical scholars, look at the guys from the Master's University and look at the guys from the Master's Seminary. Absolutely amazing what God has used them for. And this is their legacy. This is their legacy, and just Pastor John MacArthur's legacy, my pastor. That's what the legacy is. So, highly recommend it. Try if you are reading something like the King James or something like the NIV or the NLT or more thought for thought translations, I highly recommend maybe starting with the ESV, because that's a good transition, and then that will help you transition even more into a very literal translation, an excellent and even more accurate literal translation, word for word, that the LSB is. So thank you so much for watching, and I will catch you all in the next one.